So what I'd like to do in half an hour or so is, I think, rehearse some of the points that Monica and Astrid have already made, actually, very effectively, about the sensory and about the sensory turn and its relationship to thinking about urban life. But I also want to pick up, I think, the point that Monica made, that this is a project that's kind of ongoing. And I think it's particularly ongoing because it seems to me that we're at quite a sort of historical moment, actually, I guess, particularly in the way that digital technologies may be starting to shape the way that cities are managed, but also the way in which they're experienced. So I'd like to sort of speculate a little bit on that as well, just to add a kind of extra element to the discussions that are going to follow for the rest of the day. So what academics like to call the sensory turn has, of course, been with us for quite some time now, and increasingly across a whole range of aspects of social life, not just cities. We're more and more thinking about the importance of sensory experiences, of the embodied experiences of touch, taste, sound, seeing, smelling, and other feelings, senses of space and confinement, of speed and rhythm, atmosphere and light, and how important these sensory experiences are for our emotional states, for the way we make judgments, analyse and interpret things, and also for our memories. And that's true of many environments, of course, but it's especially so, I think, in cities. It's long been thought that cities bring together different kinds of sensory experiences in particularly intense kinds of ways. The noise of traffic, the push of crowds, images on billboards and hoardings, artificial light, background music, the textures of building facades and pavements, the smells of street food, perfume shops, other less pleasant smells, the visual interventions of graffiti and public screens, the vitality, the vital otherness of animals or rivers, the shape and colour of buildings. So particular forms of these sensory experiences, particular materializations of, say, building form, food smells, taxi colours and crowds, are part of what makes cities distinct from each other. Sensory experiences layer up and intersect, give an urban environment a distinct kind of feel. So just to give you an anecdote of that, I remember strolling around, it was Barcelona, in fact, with a friend from Palermo in southern Italy. We were passing a little kind of corner of a church building, I think it was, which smelled very strongly of piss. And he turned around and said to me, "Oh," he said, "a little bit of Palermo in Barcelona." Only a Palermitano, I think, could make that kind of joke, of course. So these material kind of forms and their combinations and those sensory combinations vary hugely between cities. And of course, they also vary within cities. So I think so far, both in the way that the network set up its workshops, but also in the way that I've been speaking, the kind of implicit embodied figure in our accounts of the sensory in the city has been the pedestrian. We've been walking through the public space of the sensory city, breathing its air and its aromas, perhaps noticing the texture of its pavements under our feet, looking at its shop fronts and building facades, negotiating other pedestrians and its traffic. But of course, that's not the only way that cities are experienced sensorially or indeed in embodied ways. Different kinds of sensory experiencing are also enacted when we take a bus, for example, or cycle, or sit in an auto rickshaw or a Mercedes or a metro train. And here, in those kind of spaces, experiences of rhythm, temperature, speed, crowds, wind, noise, and so on, are all mediated by the mode of transport and its social practices. And of course, I think while that's particularly obvious when we're sitting in a large piece of technology like a bus or a car, actually it's also true when we're strolling the streets as well. Our sensory experiences, a point already been made, are mediated through different kinds of technology, whether that's clothing or indeed the kind of tools we use to deploy different kinds of research methods, or other forms of representing and recording the cities, and indeed the smartphones that we carry with us. And I want to return to this notion of everyday technologies and their mediation of the urban quite centrally in this talk. And of course, there are other kinds of differences within the cities as well, not just those of technical mediations. I grew up in London, but the lower middle class suburb in which I grew up in was a world away from the bustle of Oxford Street, which I experienced when I went what we called into town on the number 25 bus. And my parents' decision to leave that suburb and move further out into suburban London was accompanied in ways I didn't quite understand at the time, this is in the early 70s, with a shift in the way our new neighbours were changing what their houses looked like and the smell of unfamiliar foods in the streets in the evening. So sensory experiences clearly mark cultural differences, and reactions to particular kinds of sights, smells, colours, rhythms are culturally specific. Different people might respond to different sensory experiences differently. So my bright new wine bar, or indeed conference venue, is another person's brash, garish environment, or indeed the erasure of a series of collective memories. And this is what happens, of course, when neighbourhoods literally get cleaned up to appeal to an international tourist trade. Monica's written about this extensively in Barcelona. So different sensory experiences of the same place can map onto bodily, cultural and social differences. Cities feel very different if you're visually impaired or a woman not used to the residents' economy of gazes, or you're mobile only with a wheelchair. And even if many city folk get used to this, as Georg Simmel argued a century ago in Berlin, if some of us adopt a blasé attitude, distance ourselves somewhat from all this sensory intensity, despite that, senses remain important to explore because as well as being central to the experiencing of places like cities and their suburbs, they're also central to the ways in which places are different, to how they change across space and time, and also, as we've already heard, therefore, to the politics of places, to their power relations. If the aesthetics of places and their sensory experiencing are related in complex and shifting, but nonetheless important ways, to social differences like age, gender, race, class, ethnicity, able-bodiedness, and so on, how urban spaces get designed, whether by high-end architects or by folk putting up extraordinary numbers of Christmas lights or designing their own shop fronts and getting a mate to build it, those kind of sensory enactments really matter. If a space is welcoming or not, tasteful or not for me or not, and to who, is down at least in part to its look, its smell, its texture, volume, flow, and memories. And perhaps for the non-English participants in the room, lots and lots of Christmas lights are coded culturally in England as a working class practice. Middle-class houses have a rather different kind of Christmas lighting that they would do. So, it's really important to think about how cities experience sensorially in the present. But also then, as Monica said, about how the sensory past is present or not. And also, I think, particularly in the present moment, about how the future of cities is also being imagined and evoked. And I want to move on now to explore one of the most important ways in which the future of urban life is being imagined, and particularly think about the kind of aesthetics and sensory range that we're being offered in those visions. I want to talk about the notion of the smart city. And I then want to offer a few thoughts on perhaps how digital technologies might well be shifting not only how cities are represented, but also how they're experienced in the cities, but perhaps not quite in the way that these visions of the future are currently visualising. So, one of the most important ways in which future cities are being imagined now is through this notion of the smart city. Can I just do a quick hands up? Who's heard of this phrase, the smart city? Whoa, okay. You're obviously on the cutting edge of urban, as you would be. Lots of people I ask about the smart city have not heard of it, which I think is a very interesting point, actually. So clearly it's a term that circulates in quite specific circles, and this is obviously one of them. In which case, you don't really need me to explain what a smart city is to you. There are lots of different definitions floating around, but a smart city is basically one that gathers data, digital data of many kinds from all sorts of sensors embedded in the urban environment and uses that data, it's argued, to manage the city more efficiently, perhaps more sustainably, and far less often, in my view, it's also posited that it might be a way to run a city more democratically. The term smarter city was actually patented by IBM in 2011, and there's enormous amounts of commercial hype surrounding the smart city. I think actually we might have reached peak smart, in fact. But nonetheless, the idea that cities can be enhanced by the use of digital technologies is widespread and is already being put into practice in many ways. And indeed, London is one of the leading smart cities, particularly because the enormous database that Transport for London collects every time you swipe your Oyster card through the gates on a tube or a bus. Okay, so a smart city involves hardware and software, and because a lot of this is new, and because in some respects a lot of the technology is new, and because in some respects, although by no means all, it's a kind of new way of thinking about how to manage a city. And above all, I think because a lot of the discussion about soft cities is led by people wanting to sell smart products at expos and certainly on social media and so on. There are images everywhere in a smart city, ranging from this kind of thing, which is a graphic put together by a Spanish company, in fact, who builds the sensors that, as you can see, those little red dots, you can put anywhere in your smart city, even apparently on the nuclear power station, which seems to be put right in the middle of it. And all these different kinds of sensors will generate different kinds of data for city managers, who will then be able to pull them together and manage the city more efficiently. So, for example, your bin, this is something that happens in Milton Keynes right now. Your bin sends out a signal, and only when your bin is full will a van come round to actually empty it for you. For example, this is supposed to be a more efficient and sustainable way to manage a city. But we need to learn about this, I guess, or at least not you, but certainly many people need to learn about smart. So these kind of graphics are very common. They explain how a smart city works. And they're all over, as I say, expos, lots of professional fairs and displays about this kind of thing, but also on social media. And I spent a little while recently looking quite carefully at the promotional videos around smart cities that you'll find on YouTube, and also the streams and streams of smart city images that flow through Twitter feed if you follow smart city accounts and smart city hashtags. So what I want to do now is play one of these videos about the smart city, which I think exemplifies actually many of the quite varied visual formats that these future visions of digitalised cities take. The video is called Future Life. It's only about 7 minutes long, so I'll play it with the sound off while I talk. We may not get to the end. It purports to show a day in the life of New York, London and Copenhagen in 2050. And there are some very interesting questions about the different manifestations of the smart city in different cities, particularly globally, which somebody like Iona Data is working extensively on. If you want to go and see the film, it's screened on a constant loop in a building called The Crystal in London Docklands, which is built by Siemens. So this is a Siemens vision of the smart city. But you can also find it, of course, on YouTube, and various stills of it have been projected and shared in various other social media as well. This film was part of a whole package of visual and interactive materials that were designed for this Siemens exhibition space by a Glasgow company called ISO, who describe themselves on their Twitter page as digital experience designers. And digital experience designers now mediate huge numbers of the everyday sorts of images that we see. This is a very high-end, very expensive, time-consuming, laborious kind of thing to produce. But a lot of much more everyday images that we see will also have been produced by a company like them, who also produce, as they say, digital media, interactive software, and immersive installations. And they're actually, I think a very interesting kind of company. They employ live-action directors, 2 and 3D animators, graphic and interface designers, scriptwriters, software developers, social media managers, and producers to create this kind of cross-generic, new, I think, kind of new form of visualization. So the content of Future Life, I think, as you can already see, is very typical of this kind of corporate vision of the smart city. The smart city is clean, it's almost entirely new. Its buildings are white with lots of green trees. I think the blue boxes, again, are explaining to us what smart is like. It's got that kind of pedagogic air as well. And I think most importantly, sunshine is another very important part of the smart city. It very rarely rains in a smart city, although... I think really most importantly in terms of critically thinking around this, everything in the smart city gets converted into data. And indeed, images of the smart city, as we're seeing now, I think when we think about a city, we see it photographically, we see it photorealistically. Now, increasingly, those photos are dissolved. They are, of course, themselves now digital, and those photographic images are being converted into data and data flows, this kind of glow of data. Which, in fact, data, of course, is now both photographs, they're digital files, but you can see here we've got digital maps, we've got these kind of translucent massing studies, we have panoramic views, aerial photography traditions are being drawn on, all these kinds of image types, which I think until a few years ago were actually quite distinct genres, often used by particular professions to think about the city, and now being blurred into this collective digital visualization of what life will be like in these, say, sunny, pale, cool, smart cities. Now, I think actually we could say a great deal about the aesthetics of this kind of visual production. I think it has a lot of connections to the contemporary ways of architectural visualizations. I think there's also relations to computer game design, histories of panoramic views, science fiction. There's a whole lot we could get into there. But what I want to, the particular strand I want to pull out is this way that the city is being kind of blurred into, overlaid with, underpinned by a glowing network of data. And the way that photographic realism fades into that digital flow, which suggests that we are now experiencing the city through these kind of digital mediations, rather than through photographic or cinematic visions. So what might that digital feel like then? What might its kind of sensory engagement, its embodied experience feel like? Well, what it strikes me as being like is something that's where rhythm and flow and movement are absolutely central. We can see this in the visual content of this visualization, where different kinds of images are constantly morphing and flowing into other kinds of images. So we have map to 3D model to photograph to this kind of mobile point of view, which I originally thought was a helicopter, but somebody suggested to me actually it's probably a drone. But there's also a really strong emphasis on the sweeping, smooth, seamlessness of digital flow, on communication and swiping and the kind of surge. There's no glitch or friction in this vision of the city. And that's absolutely critical to the ways in which data is understood to work in the smart city. It will be gathered, it will be transmitted through Wi-Fi in these visions, as opposed to kind of cables or satellites, which is, I think, actually what happens more often than Wi-Fi. And logical decisions will then follow from this smooth stream of data. And in fact, those decisions may well not often be made by people, they'll be made by algorithms and software in what geographers have called the automatic production of space. And as I say, there's no friction, no glitches, no bugs, no software updates, and no security breaches. And also, I should add, no debate. The only visions of democracy we get in these kind of images are either people getting information from a local government or voting in referendum. So democracy is being reduced to a transfer of information in these visions rather than a kind of debate between people with different interests. And the people making decisions, if they're not algorithms, they're almost entirely white men in these videos, which is absolutely extraordinary. Okay, so in these visions of the future then, we're being offered a very specific sensory experience, which the designers of these promotional images presumably think we will find attractive. Now, for various reasons, and perhaps particularly for this audience, I'm sure many of these people, and many of us in this room, actually find these images rather unattractive, or at the very least, actually really quite boring. These cool cities with their pale tones and their smooth functioning kind of seem to miss, in some ways, the whole point of city life. its crowded, rowdy dynamism, the kind of vitality that sensory experiencing of the city really speaks to, its diversity, its smells, its sounds. The only soundtrack you tend to get in these cities, actually in this case, is the kind of quiet buzz of a drone as it flies over the city, or else it's that kind of cute Apple, sort of plinky-plonky background music with a kind of soothing voiceover kind of telling you how all this is really going to be, absolutely this urban utopia. Now, it's kind of easy to come up with those kind of critiques, and although that doesn't mean they're not justified. But I think looking at the visual content of these images and kind of dismissing them out of hand simply as glossy adverts actually underplays their importance and their power, I think. Because as I've already suggested, I think there's something about their flow and rhythm and connectivity that's very striking and actually very pervasive. And that's partly, in fact, because I think, as far as I understand it, similar kinds of software platforms are used to design an awful lot of the different ways in which we are now being invited to engage with or mediate our experience of the city through various kinds of digital technologies. So there's something about that flow and rhythm, the emphasis on mobility and connectivity that is actually widespread. And actually, it perhaps is not that far from the kind of constant flow and morphing and transition in terms of how we interact with our smartphones in our everyday lives when we're in city streets, not least. Because, of course, most sensory bodies now, in many cities, of course, by no means all, are equipped with that digital prosthetic device known as the smartphone. And in many visions of the smart city, it's smartphones that convert the human body into data. Where a body is, for example, through its transmission through the phone of geolocated data, how it's feeling through the sentiment analysis of tweets that get sent out. Huge amounts of money are currently being invested in automatic visual software analysis, so that, for example, Virgin can tell how successfully their trains are running by analysing people's expressions as they get off their train, recorded on CCTV, analysed automatically, how many people look happy, how many people look really irritated. They can evaluate their service provision in these kinds of ways. So, and in turn, we scan and stream and swipe, in our own digital activities, steadily following a Google trail of blue dots, scrolling up and down our social media feeds and our WhatsApp messages in this constant swipe logic, swipe culture, as I recently heard it described, actually in the context of Grindr, but that's maybe another area we won't necessarily get into. Okay, so we might think then that digital tech is mediating our experience of the sensory city then. So perhaps then when we're on our smartphones, we don't hear and see the city in the same way. Although, of course, I've got here, you need to be extra attentive to crowds if you're also trying to message while you're walking. Of course, a lot of people aren't, and that's really irritating. But our digital selves are also mediating the city, perhaps turning it from a scene, something we picture, into something that we flow and navigate through. So when we're on our Instagram feeds and our Twitter accounts, our experience of one place then, the place that we're physically inhabiting, starts to be inflected by the arrival of sounds and images from another place. And in a really interesting book reflecting on the current state of cinema, Francesco Cassetti calls this hypertopia. He suggests that images from one place are increasingly saturating the experiencing of another. And maybe these are only fleeting glimpses as we look quickly at our Facebook page before we move on to smell the coffee in the street or whatever. But I think it starts to suggest perhaps a different agenda and perhaps a different way of thinking about the sensory and the digital right now. Less perhaps through thinking about what we are presented with as we walk through a city street, and perhaps more what that kind of amorphous cloud of immense kind of tactile digital imagery, how that starts to kind of intervene and flow back into our experience of the city street through screens, partly through our smartphone screens, but also increasingly through those big digital screens that you'll find in train stations and other public spaces in cities. So that poses a rather different question, for example, about what a smart city looks like. Perhaps actually it doesn't look like the kind of visual content of the video I just showed you. Perhaps what it looks like is that vague impression you might get as you stream through thousands of images attached to smart city tweets, or you flick through 20 YouTube videos, kind of, which all in the end kind of look the same because it's all the same corporate voice. Perhaps there's a different sense of the digital intervention into the city. So I want to end with showing you another version of what the smart city looks like, and then make a couple of points perhaps about how that might then inflect the sensory experiencing of the city. So rather than looking at one image of a smart city in detail, what happens if you start to look at thousands of them? So I worked with a computer scientist at the OU, Alastair Willis. He very kindly scraped 22,000 images from Twitter over a period, I think it's about 10 days, in November last year, all of which had a smart city-related hashtag and an image attached to them. 22,000 included retweets, which I think kind of broke the software I was trying to use. So I ended up with 9,000 tweets. And this is what smart cities look like. And what I'm trying to evoke here is that sense not of a specific image, but of a flow, a digital flow, a kind of cloud that lands and shifts and moves on again. And I think what we can see here is that actually smart cities pictured on Twitter tend to be either kind of orange and brown, or they tend to be blue and turquoise. Orange and brown, it turns out, and using this software you can zoom into the individual images and come out again. Orange and brown are buildings and people, their bodies. They're white bodies, but they look orange in lots of smartphone photos without flash of smart city events, including the big Barcelona Smart City Expo. Or if they're blue, they are digital images, because of course we all know digital is blue in color coding world of visualizations. Or they're the blue skies of pictures of lovely smart cities. So smart city then, in terms of this a sort of cloud or an atmosphere, it's more perhaps about colour than it is about other kinds of content. And this connects to recent work emerging from a bunch of media theorists, particularly Mark Hansen, who is starting to talk about new media, digital media, as atmospheres. Not as about platforms that carry images and representations, but rather as sensory atmospheres, which often catch us below our conscious level of awareness, although colour is, I think, clearly a different case. Hansen talks about media being elemental or ambient or climatological. So I'd like to end my first final point is that perhaps we should also be thinking about this atmospheric digital ambience as another dimension of the sensory through which cities are now being mediated. It's mobile, it's fluid, and it has different intensities as we engage or not with particular kinds of screens, and therefore mediates other kinds of sensory engagements with cities as we more or less intensely see this kind of thing. But also, my second final point is that if that's the case, if we have this kind of digital cloud that's starting to refract our other sensory engagements with the city, how then do those earlier questions that I think we're now actually really quite good at asking, although the answers are always complex, about the politics of the sensory, about the differential distribution of different kinds of sensory experiencing and understanding and so on, how do those sorts of questions play into this new digital sensorium? I think actually we're only at the very beginning of asking those kinds of questions, but I would hope that the kind of debates I hope we can start having today would at least give us some directions in terms of beginning to discover some answers to that. So thank you very much.